So I would like to invite to the stage Megan Kennedy-Chouane. You're head of evaluation at the OECD DAC-EVALNET. And then Professor Torbjörn Becker, last time you were here, you were Director for Site and Chair of EBA, and you, I think you still are, so please, welcome back. So, first of all, before turning to kind of some kind of an organized discussion of this, I would like to ask you, having heard what Tymofiy said, do you have any comments, reflections, reactions to that, Megan?
I have just to really emphasize what Tymofiy was saying, that we have to be in it for the long run if we're building institution and capacity. You know, the fact that we have been in Kyiv and working with the Kyiv School for the last 20 years is the reason that Tymofiy is standing here today. It's part of, you know, the infrastructure that makes it possible to fundraise here in Stockholm to support the students of the Kyiv School. We could not have started this in the middle of this crisis, of course. So, you know, that also makes it quite complicated when you think about development assistance, because we cannot always foresee what are the future circumstances when this project we're doing today is actually going to be extremely important. But again, I think building capacity, education, and thinking about research, to me, those are quite fundamental things that may not pay back tomorrow, but certainly over time.
Yes.
There we go. Hello. Yes, thank you all. Really appreciate the conversation, and thank you to all of you for hosting this. I think it's an incredibly important subject. And as I listened to your story, what actually came to my mind was a saying that we have of those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. And I think that is a fundamental challenge within the discussions on how do we use evidence to inform international cooperation. So one, we can do everything we can possibly do to ensure that those staff working in CEDA or in the immigration agency or other agencies have the best evidence and are using it, or staying on top of it, as Rachel said. But if they're trying to take decisions about a country that they don't know and don't understand, it's fundamentally flawed. And so I think there's a real challenge of how do we actually create systems that prioritize and center the experience of people who are actually being impacted by the intended programs. So I think that's really, really important, and I've heard very little about the role of people who are impacted by the programs that are being funded by Sweden, and I think that needs to come into this conversation on evidence. So really important, and thank you for sharing your experience and for your work.
And that might be something that we might return to. I think it's interesting when you listen to a talk, sometimes you see how people react, and I think that literally, not maybe everyone, but almost, when you said that capability cannot be built in emergency, we're taking notes and writing that down. And I think that is really, I think, at the heart of the humanitarian development nexus, isn't it? How you kind of need both. And there is, I would like to turn to kind of, this isn't kind of the first crisis or conflict or war where you've had international or official development assistance to be provided. There are a lot of learning, and there's quite a lot of synthesis having been made on what are kind of effective solutions under those situations. So I'm looking at Megan now, and I would like you to start kind of giving us a picture of what have we learned from other cases, and how could that possibly, knowing kind of how context matters, how could that possibly be relevant for aid to Ukraine? Please.
Yeah. Thank you so much, and I think it's a really important point to think about when does context matter and how does context matter. And I would just say to start off that I think in some sense all experience is completely context specific. So we're here in Stockholm, maybe our review of evidence of what works in Stockholm doesn't apply in Malmo, maybe what works in Sweden doesn't apply in Norway. And so this idea that every context is very unique. And in one sense, we could say you can never draw evidence from any other context. It has to be contextually led, based on the power, on the culture, on the institutions, et cetera. On the other hand, I work for an international organization whose motto is better policies for better lives. And the OECD is, of course, premised on the idea that we can identify in some way what those better policies are and share them internationally so that we can raise the bar. And I think it's really important to point out that the goal of those policy changes is actually better lives. So we have to be clear on the objectives. And I think, so in many ways, yes, Ukraine is unique. Ukraine is not Afghanistan. Ukraine is not Bosnia 30 years ago. Ukraine is not Somalia or Gaza. On the other hand, we see that across the syntheses, that there have been several syntheses looking at long-term evidence, not only from evaluations, but from other research sources, impact evaluations, looking at common findings in Afghanistan, in the Sahel region, in other conflict regions. And what we've seen, and I actually found quite surprising, is that a lot of the evidence rings very true across quite diverse contexts. And so I think that was actually a key flaw that we have seen in the international response to Ukraine, was an assumption that Ukraine was unique and very different. And that the lessons that had been hard learned from international development cooperation over the last 40 years somehow didn't apply. I think this is really a huge challenge in Ukraine today, because I think it led to a lack of drawing on the evidence and an underutilization of evidence that was there, which meant that we made mistakes that could have been avoided had we taken a bit more nuanced perspective to the evidence. And I'll give you those sort of 4 key lessons that we've extracted from the evidence from synthesis work. But just one other thought. I think, at the OECD, when we started, I mentioned the importance of thinking about the objective of our international assistance. When we look at support to countries in war, we also have this objective of being seen to be in solidarity with Ukraine. And so that's a very important element. There's a visibility element that you see in conflict-affected countries where we're at war, which is quite different from actually saying we're providing with the pure objective of the most cost-effective thing we could possibly be funding as Sweden. There's also an importance of the solidarity impact effect. So what have we seen in terms of the evidence? We've seen the sort of realistic expectation that we're talking about a whole of society effort that is going to be decades long, even if the war was to end today. And as you mentioned, you're quite pessimistic about that idea. So there is a real need for sequenced approach and support that is adaptive. We see huge problems around the incentives. Now, part of the reason I mentioned that lessons can be learned across conflict contexts is that the lessons aren't only about what Afghans are doing or what Kenyans are doing. They're about what Swedish people are doing and what British people are doing and what French development agencies are doing or what the World Bank is doing, what UN agencies are doing. So these lessons that we've learned about how incentives are created can actually be shared across contexts. And what we see is that when you have incentives to spend money quickly, it creates huge problems. And we see this in the climate space now, we see it in other sectors and areas, not just in conflict, but especially in conflicts where you have absorptive capacity challenges. And this idea that we can't sort of build the ship while we're sailing it, right? So it's very difficult. So looking really at the incentives, what are the incentives that are in place? And then also an overemphasis on sort of short-term quantitative objectives like delivering activities, rather than looking at the larger effects. And what we've seen is there's a great report I would really recommend reading from the Special Investigator for Afghanistan in the US, and it's called Doing the Wrong Things Perfectly. And they look at the challenge of the whole system and machinery around monitoring, reporting, and evaluations, which are very necessary in conflict settings. But what they found was an overemphasis on contract compliance related to the aid funding that was really missing the forest for the trees, as we say. So you've delivered the goods, you've done this, but you're missing the transformational effects that this is happening. And I would actually tend to disagree with some of our earlier speakers. On the one hand, it's simple. On the other hand, it's incredibly complex. And the intervention of foreign actors in any community has unintended effects. There are differences between parts of the population. So this idea of really looking at what are those overarching effects, for example, the relationship between communities and their government, the perception of different governments and their legitimacy, These are hugely important and complex elements, and aid is not only a force for good, it can also cause harm in those settings. I think one other point that we have seen in our analysis of evaluations and other research is the need to be conflict sensitive and to recognize that sometimes the most helpful thing is not to do something. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is a need in the current context, and I would say that the hope and the generosity that we have seen coming in the response of especially European countries to the full-scale war of aggression against Ukraine is both a benefit and a risk. So at the OECD, just to share a very quick story and then I'll wrap up, when the war first started, our Secretary General made an announcement of an OECD-wide strategy to support Ukraine, drawing on policy experience across the organization, so not only in development cooperation, but other areas as well. And there was a huge push to express solidarity. We lit up the OECD headquarters in yellow and blue, and the Secretary General sent out a message to all staff saying, "We're collecting clothing for Ukraine." And they opened a small space, and everyone donated their old shirts and sweatshirts and shoes, and I'm sitting there with, in my mind, what the humanitarian colleague mentioned about cash assistance, right? All of us who've worked for years and seen how effective cash-based support, budget support, for example, can be. And here we are ourselves collecting our old tennis shoes to somehow ship to Ukraine across from France all the way over. And I think, in my mind, it's this idea of it's not only what is the most cost-effective way, but we want to be seen to be in solidarity with Ukraine. And that's a real challenge. And I think that can, on the one hand, positively lead to speed, lead to a level of generosity in Ukraine that we've never seen anywhere else, lead to, generosity towards Ukrainian refugees that we've never seen in other conflict settings. On the other hand, it can lead to these pet projects that are highly visible and are actually ultimately not reaching the ultimate goals in the context and actually could be diverting funds or even causing harm. So thank you.
Thank you, Megan. Torbjörn, I guess you have comments on those. What is it to learn from other contexts and also the four kind of overarching conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, we have been involved in our network with Tymofiy and others thinking about the whole governance setup when it comes from the donor side. How do we organize the donor community to actually make aid the most efficient way that Ukraine actually needs it and wants it? So, I think we did a few studies comparing these kind of programs and, of course, the Marshall Fund to Europe after the Second World War and so on. So, I think we can take some lessons on those kind of issues. At the same time, I think it's just extremely important to put what we're doing together for Ukraine in perspective, that this is not, a regular development assistance program from Sweden. We have to be open and just say, this is the defense of a sovereign country in Europe that we want to become a member of the European Union. This is not our regular development assistance program somewhere else. And if you look at what Sweden has been sending to Ukraine, the military part, of course, is way bigger than the aid part, even if we are here talking about aid. Aid for Ukraine is actually now, archers and JAS Gripen and these kind of things. That's like the fundamental thing. So
wouldn't be DAC-able, right?
Exactly. No, but I just think so. Sometimes when we have these discussions, if you look at the Ukrainian budget, at least I think ballpark 60% is now military, in Ukraine's budget. And like half of the Ukrainian government's budget comes from external sources. It's just extreme in so many different ways that I'm a little bit worried that, let's put it this way. There are ways of doing this right, and there are 10 million ways of not doing this right. And I think, we had this little discussion before with Tymofiy. Can we talk about corruption and the issues of corruption? And we have already touched on this here. But, we actually have to a little bit just say, you know, the Ukrainians today have so much at stake. They need to be so much involved in the whole process of how to spend the funds in the best way, exactly because they are the experts. They understand what's going on at the school or in the local building, etc. So, you know, yeah, I think this is a unique setting, and really we should be learning from this. Maybe not now. I think we need to have some time passing before we can draw strong conclusions, but it's going to be a learning experience. But I also think it is quite unique, even if we should take some, I think, structural and governance issues with us from other contexts.
Tymofiy, may I turn to you? What are then your reflections on that? Are we are external donors kind of doing the wrong things in a good way, or are they doing wrong things in a wrong way, or what would be your?
So, okay, so I've over my 10 years in Ukraine building the school. I think it grew maybe 30 times in the budget in 10 years, and something comparable in number of students and facilities. And I've learned that it's better to get things done rather than not to get them done perfectly. I think it's very important. I mean, you want to have some rate, in the sense that when we were doing emergency fundraising in the beginning of the war, similar to what discussed, and it really pissed me off. So I agree with that when people were sending us pumpers through, and it was basically clogging up the customs. And we needed weapons to get through the customs, and they were checking, you know, trucks of toilet paper. That's actually direct damage, very visible damage, because trucks with weapons, then, okay, maybe not weapons, but inputs, civilian inputs, because weapons go through without, but then, you know, it just actually people die because of this, at least in 2022. It's not a joke, it's like real. I mean, I understand people want to feel good, and I think it's very important to continue to create the atmosphere in which people feel good. Because sustainability is not only about institutions, sustainability of support or relationship. And sustainability of relationship is really about community building. If you remember, I started talking by thanking about 100 people indirectly in Sweden who have given donations as small as, you know, $10 and as large as hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so we're very grateful, and it's a community. We care about these people who care about us. And so I think that's also is an important part of sustainability. And we want taxpayers to continue to support a cause. We want to make taxpayers feel that this is a worthy cause. Yeah, so whatever that means. But then in practical terms, when we were doing emergency fundraising in the beginning of the war, in the full-scale invasion, I basically talked to some NATO generals and asked what's the leakage rate in emergency, let's say in Iraq or Afghanistan. They said everything under 20% is considered to be okay. That's a cost of emergency in war. So yeah, we got screwed, there were scams, there was fraud. I didn't bother if my rate of fraud was less than 10%. I simply didn't have time, and I didn't care. It's a cost of doing business in that situation. Yes, some Israeli companies screwed us and, you know, stole $1.2 million, and some Netherlands companies submitted poor quality bulletproof vests to a partner, and people almost got shot. Thank God someone tested them. And so, but it was minuscule relative to the overall volume. So basically, a very practical way is to accept the amount of waste, corruption, or anything you're willing to tolerate in a given situation. And then as you move out of emergency, you tighten it up, ideally to zero, but something to sort of acceptable, like compliance does. But, and you look at it very pragmatically. You know, you say, listen, this is what I can tolerate now, and this is what I want to tolerate. It's like inflation targeting in central bank policies. You target 2% inflation, or in the United States or here, or 5% in Ukraine. But of course, during the war, we are okay with 10, you know? So, and then we go back to 5. So I think that should be a policy, you know. Otherwise, it's abstract. Is corruption bad? It gets in the public domain and makes it everything toxic, and it's not operationalized. So basically, my take on this is there is waste, there is inefficiency, there is incompetence, there is corruption, there is just organized crime, stealing things of, like some of our goods, for example, not ours, but another agencies like Jersey. Out of 100 pallets, huge pallets on a plane of medical kits, 95 were switched. Only 5 arrived to Poland. That's mafia in Jersey, That's not even European, it's not even Ukraine. That happens. That happens when you need to get things fast. That happens. So you just look at the rate, that you are willing to accept. So very pragmatic attitude, get things done, have a very clear objective of what is being achieved. So, and it's okay in the beginning, in the emergency to do something like closing, that's fine too, maybe not that specific case, but it's okay. And immediately pivot into institution and capability building, immediately. So even with the military aid assistance today, the right way is not to send, in my view, weapons which are produced here, but to use models where you build defense production capabilities, both in Ukraine and in Sweden, which respond to the new doctrine that we all are facing, but the lobby and the military-industrial complex is still trying to think in terms of tanks. Tanks will not survive more than half an hour in a new warfare, so tanks are irrelevant. So I think you want to start with emergency and pivot towards capability buildings immediately while monitoring the rates of waste in the process. I think that should be the model.
Okay. So it's a little bit about having to build a ship while you're sailing it. That's
both. You have to do both.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any quick comments to this, or shall we turn to the audience? Okay. Yeah, maybe just one. Okay, yeah, I heard you. So, yeah.
No. I think this point on, it reminds me of that saying, the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago, but the second best time is today. And I think that's, to think of what's helpful to you today. But I just wanted to touch briefly on budget support, as that had been mentioned as well. And what we saw from the COVID-19 crisis was that in several countries, budget support was actually used very effectively to straddle this balance between accepting imperfect and moving very quickly, while also trying to support and at least not undermine the long-term prospects. And so what we saw was that budget support was actually a very effective crisis response instrument during the COVID-19 crisis. It allowed governments to have the flexibility to respond in ways that were flexible, given there was a lack of certainty of what the needs would be. But they were especially effective where they aligned with existing reform processes and didn't simply put on hold those broader governance reform processes. And so I think even in the context of providing humanitarian assistance or short-term support for rebuilding, for example, in the context of the ongoing war, there are always opportunities to keep in mind that longer-term trajectory of where Ukraine is headed and how we can build local institutions. And I think the example of supplies management, building supply in the country as opposed to replacing it from external is a good example as well. That I think there are always opportunities for that long-term perspective.
And of course, we can also talk a lot about potential challenges with budget support and so on. But it's interesting to see how budget support is now a priority in aid to Ukraine, whereas it has kind of fallen out of fame in many other situations. We know that, I guess that almost every one of you are representing an agency who has a government assignment relating to official development assistance to Ukraine. So we would like to hear from you.
So now we would like you to, for the next 5 or 6 minutes, just turn to the person sitting next to you and discuss 3 questions that we'll put up here on the screen as well. And then we will take your questions and turn back to the expert panel. But so the questions that we would like you to reflect on in couples is what issues that we've discussed this morning are most relevant for the kind of development cooperation that you will all be engaged in going forward. What are your key takeaways from the discussion so far? And what specific questions would you like to ask our panel? So 5 minutes or so. So that will give you a few minutes to... Oh. That was... Very sorry to interrupt. Hello?
There were a few persons interested to discuss this, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
That was a wonderful buzz that we have in the room now, which is exactly what we wanted. So thank you so much for that. Now let's hear a couple of reflections and questions from the room. So we already have a hand raised there. And then there.
And may I just, before you start saying that, I mean, we will not kind of be able to harvest all of your brilliant reflections and comments now, but the takeaways from this day will be documented by EBA. So if you have anything that you think was not covered and you want to feed in something, please remember to mail us it, and we will be sure to include it in the documentation of today.
But now, let's first hear.
Thank you so much for the discussions. I've introduced myself earlier, but Anzi from Chief Economist team at SIDA. So I'll come back to that capability thing. So what you mentioned is preparedness is the real determinant of effectiveness. Does the evidence suggest that the constraints in crisis response is actually the donor systems rather than the crisis conditions? And what would it take for preparedness investments to become politically as compelling as emergency responses? Like, how do we sell that rhetoric? And coming to Megan on the evidence is inherently context specific. We've heard that a lot. But what should donors change in how they interpret and apply it across diverse conflict settings? What capabilities are needed to fill that gap? And learning from the Ukraine experiences, could you point out any evidence that challenges the current donor practices and we should change something about it? Thank you so much.
Thank you. We'll collect 3 questions or reflections. No.
No, please.
Okay. Here's another one.
Hello, my name is Åsa Regnér, and this is real teamwork between Alexander and myself. So we were curious, Megan, to start with, about, you said that there were omissions made, or there was experience and evidence from other war zones that could have been applied to the Ukraine case, but they were omitted because the assumption was that this is such a specific case. So we were just curious, what could those lessons learned have been that would have been useful for Ukraine? And we also wondered if you know, why do you think those assumptions were made? Why were those examples or that knowledge not used, in case you know? And also we'd like to express a lot of solidarity with you, Professor, and with your students. Thank you for your leadership.
Thank you. And here? I don't think this one works, so.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Timothy. That was really enlightening and an experience. This is me, head of Africa at SIDA. My question, I think, goes to Torbjörn, because based on Timothy's presentation, when we have to do things, we have to accept inefficiencies and waste. When you said 10% is what you sort of thumb through. And then when we move into a more warish situation, that has to be changed. Torbjörn, is there any research that we've done in the EBA or any thinking on how do we manage this? Because we see these conflicts in Eastern Congo, we see civil war in Ethiopia, in Sudan. How should we reason about this in a realistic but efficient way?
Please, Torbjörn, you can start.
When I still remember the question. Thank you. I have to be honest with you, I don't know what that research is or where we get it. I think from my perspective, I guess this has to be a continuous process. And I think, like already Tymofiy alluded to, this is a process that already started in Ukraine during the war. So, you know, it's not like we have a magic bullet to take it from 20 or 10 to 2. But, you know, I think the usual things like coordinating donors, transparency when it comes to procurement, all of these regular things needs to be there. And then, I mean, it's really a practical matter of how you can implement it under current conditions. I mean, the standard example, I guess, from Ukraine is that a lot of the military procurement cannot be made transparent and public for obvious reasons. So, you know, that, yeah, some of these things will have to take time.
Of good elements there. I think maybe taking this question on what lessons weren't learned and why, I probably wouldn't have a systematic answer, and I guess others would know more about the Ukraine context, but just to give two examples from the work that we've done. One was we did a very large review of hosting refugee populations in 2016 to support the response to Syrian refugees. And so we actually had a lot of very strong evidence about refugee hosting. And one key message that was very difficult to pass when the Ukraine conflict started in 2022 was the sense of time. And so the top lesson that came out of this huge review we did on hosting refugee was this is going to be a multi-decade, almost certainly, multiple decades of refugee populations. This is not people who are going to return to their country in 3 months. And I think to the why question, I think it was just such a depressing prospect at the outset of the conflict that really created a barrier to people accepting that as a core message, despite the fact that we had lots and lots of evidence that said, you know, almost no matter what, standing here today, we know that this will be something that you must approach from a perspective of a many years time frame. Now that links to maybe an example of a positive side is that a lesson that some hosting countries and then also within Ukraine have tried was this idea of not building parallel systems, but integrating displaced people into existing social safety nets. So not having, you know, two separate systems for cash transfers or school, et cetera, but trying as much as you can to integrate into existing systems. And that, what I say, is a sort of a positive example, at least in some cases, where that lesson had been learned and was applied. And why was Ukraine viewed as being so different? I think, you know, at the first level, it's exactly what you just said about Ukraine being a neighbor to Europe, being a future potential EU member, and the sort of political context. I think we can't dismiss also the implicit bias that is in the nature of international development assistance and use of evidence. I think when you see people who are culturally similar, ethnically similar, it has a different effect on populations, and I don't think that is a negligible effect on how people use and perceive evidence, and also how we perceive the potential for external people to do something useful, which is a good thing on the one hand, and on the other hand, it can lead to a simplification of and an exclusion of people who are actually impacted. So.
Thanks. Timothy, what are you, maybe to both the questions and what Torbjörn and Megan said.
Okay, so I think there's a fantastic question in the beginning about whether the constraint is the donor systems or the capacity during the crisis, and you know, a cheap answer is both. In practical terms, what I've seen is, for example, why did we engage borderline, you know, violating compliance, not really, but borderline, kind of into procurement of bulletproof vests in the first weeks of the invasion? Well, because it took the government contracts to get planes on 2 months. You know, and people were shooting in Kyiv. And so we use our partners, our alumni, our friends in McKinsey, in Deloitte, and, you know, to source credibly, and we used our partners through our fundraising network to fund it, and used our government contacts to sort of get the regulation was not there, by the way, too, you know. So I think that's an important part. What we have seen is that basically the more kind of, you know, the most exciting example is that there is a fund, one of the UN funds is called Education Cannot Wait. But it can, apparently. So, you know, it took them 1.5 years to formulate a program. And it took them 2 years to deploy funding since political decision to fund it. So we only got funding last year. an example of 4 or 8 or something like that NGOs supporting schools, $13 million, like for a company, for organization like us, non-trivial amount, 3 years, okay? So that's an example. So we basically have an internal blacklist at KEC of international organizations with whom we do not work for this kind of constraints, okay? And by the way, organizations are very different. Very, very different. And governments are very, very different. So it's not, there's no blank kind of answer that, oh, it's a donor constraint. Actually, it depends on internal structure of organizations. Some organizations are excellent, but some are ridiculously, they shouldn't exist. They're simply waste of trust and taxpayers' funds. Now, so there is a second point, how do you turn from this emergency feel to something sustainable? And I think we discussed it at the, while you were also discussing questions. It's a natural question. People peak at the emergency and then they disappear. So what you want to pivot them into something sustainable. But you use the language sort of non-sexy. You have to make it sexy. You have to make sustainability sexy. Sustainability here today in this discussion and everywhere else is not sexy. You make it sexy by focusing on the community which supports rather than on the object. What we have found, I'm going to be, again, very pragmatic. What we have found is that no one cares about a specific student at KEC, at the Kyiv School of Economics. But people care about getting together 1,000 people, from high net worth individuals to Nobel laureates to top EU officials to, to a grad student in Bologna, to do something good. And that's how we are sustainable. Like when I send them pictures of students studying, my fundraising response is 1/2 of what if I send them a video of me talking who else donated and how they are all doing so it has to be about your taxpayers first and Ukraine second. If you want to make it about Ukraine first and funding second. And it actually falls upon Ukraine to facilitate it. We have to come and build horizontal relationships, friendships, so that people feel that we are part of you, that taxpayers support. And what you can do is to provide infrastructure for Ukrainians to speak to the taxpayers and show appreciation and community building. I want to say one little important thing, which answers all other questions which were in the room.
Fantastic, fantastic, great, please.
And I think it was framed as how do we move from less warring situation into how do we go into sort of environment which is less war, how do we figure out how do we over time. I think the challenge is not whether it's war or not. I mentioned when I spoke that it's a typical 4th year of the war. So it's shocking for you because you're not in war. But you would be also speaking like that if you were in war, okay? On the 4th year, you would be, it's a typical winter of a war, People die around, it's cold, it's typical. Okay, like we all are used that people die in traffic accidents, Okay, so people die from missiles, So you get used to it. What is really a problem is when environment changes, when there is a shock. Then no one knows what to do because it's different from yesterday. So we all have to adapt. What we tend to do during that situation, we tend to solve the problem instead of by leadership and adaptation, we try to double down on technical management. More money, more resources, more task teams. That's why education can wait for 3 years. Because more bureaucrats who will make a proper decision. Then a fear of fiduciary duty, compliance and accountability comes in, which paralyzes the system. The fundamental conflict is that you need to change when the environment changes, and to change you can't figure it out, you have to experiment. Experimentation means high level of risk, waste, inefficiency, and also unclear criteria how to decide what success is. That's very contrary to any kind of the organization which works with taxpayers' money. So the real innovation in development assistance would be to figure out a safe pocket in these organizations which can experiment and then scale what works outside of the experimentation sandbox. I think that's kind of the fundamental challenge, yes.
Thank you. I'm not sure that you kind of answered everything.
Experimentation will.
But you sure provided a lot of food for thought. And I think that we're actually out of time. And I think that we might think about organizing kind of a whole day conference on this topic, because I think there's so much to discuss.
But we will now have to conclude for lunch. And let's give a big hand to our wonderful speakers.